Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on a listen-only mode for the duration of today's conference until we reach the question and answer portion, at which point you may press star 1 if you would like to ask a question. I would also like to inform the conference that today's call is being recorded, and if you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. It is my pleasure to turn it over to our host this evening, Mr. Jared Leo. Thank you, sir. You may begin.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining. This is the Thursday webcast series. It's a bi-monthly webcast held at the lunch hour. The trainings leverage local successes by amplifying to a larger audience 2 model organizations, methods, materials, and approaches. And today, sessions are planned to last no more than 1 hour, with 2 presenters speaking on the same topic from slightly different perspectives, each for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. Today's format is slightly different, as we'll introduce in a moment, because we have a team presenting. So they'll present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for questions and answers. Today's session is approved by the ISA for 1 CEU hour and by SAF for 1 CFE Category 1. If you haven't already given me your certification number, you can email me after this session. Alternatively, most state landscape architecture boards require only a certificate of completion, which the Alliance for Community Trees can provide to members who request this afterwards as well. This is a program of the Alliance for Community Trees, and we encourage you to consider joining if you're not a member. We want to thank today's sponsors of the call, the Home Depot Foundation and the USDA Forest Service. Today's session is Tree Ordinances and Design Standards. As urban areas expand, communities want to preserve open lands and environmentally sensitive areas and mitigate environmental problems related to development. Often a tree ordinance is a key aspect of the framework for managing community forests and, in general, public resources. It provides legal authority for defining municipal responsibility for public and private trees, conducting forestry programs, passing regulations, and setting minimum standards for management. The intersection of nonprofit community leaders, government agencies, and experienced land use professionals is where effective tree ordinances, land preservation strategies, and environmental mitigation plans often begin to help ensure that their communities develop sustainably. Today we're pleased to have 2 associates from Clarion Associates joining us. Chad Meadows is Senior Associate with Clarion's Chapel Hill office. He's a planner with over 13 years of experience in public and private sector planning and has worked on a diverse array of projects, including land development codes, subdivision standards, design standards and guidelines, and comprehensive and growth management plans. Prior to joining Clarion Associates, he oversaw the Land Development Ordinance update in Cary, North Carolina, worked as the senior planner on growth management issues in Monroe County, Florida, and worked in the telecommunications industry in states across the country. Chad holds both a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Portland State University, a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. Craig Richardson is a planner, lawyer, and vice president of Clarion. He is the director of the firm's North Carolina office. Craig has consulted with over 100 local government clients in a number of states throughout the country on the preparation of development codes, growth management strategies, and adequate public facility regulations, tree protection issues, and impact fees. Examples of some of the recent code projects which he has led include those in Portsmouth, Virginia, Monroe, Mooresville, North Carolina, Currituck County, Fayetteville, and High Point, North Carolina, Rock Hill and Foley Beach, South Carolina, Daytona Beach and Pompano Beach, Florida, Biloxi, Mississippi, Williamston County, Tennessee, and Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He has written on a number of plan implementation issues and has served on the faculty for APA's National Zoning Clinic since 2006. He has also been actively involved in the development of the Model Sustainable Development Code for the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute. We're extremely thrilled to welcome Chad and Craig.
Great. Jared, you turn this over to us then?
You're up.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, hello, everyone. I am Craig Richardson, and Chad Meadows. Chad is with me, and it's a pleasure for us to be here. What we are talking about today, or wanted to cover with you, is designing effective tree ordinances. This is something that we have had an opportunity to do in our practice work over the last 10 years. It's interesting in that I think a number of local governments have become increasingly interested in tree canopy protection, tree protection generally, in their development codes. We've seen a real uptick in communities that want to either A, strengthen their existing tree protection regulations, or B, adopt tree protection regulations where they haven't been in place in the past. What we would like to do today for you is cover 3 or 4 basic issues in designing effective tree ordinance. First of all, I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about some legal considerations that we think are important to take into account when you are designing your an effective tree ordinance. After I do that, Chad's going to take about 20 minutes and talk about what we have, based on our practice experience, what we have found to be effective elements of a tree ordinance. So with that said, in terms of the background, let's talk a little bit about some legal considerations. And I think the most important question that you have to ask, or community has to ask before they begin the design of a tree ordinance in their local jurisdiction is, are we authorized under state law to adopt such a regulation? And with that said, I highly encourage everyone to talk with their local town attorney, county attorney, or if there's a special counsel that you're using about this question. Generally speaking, across the country, there are 3 types of local government power, zoning and environmental powers to control or regulate environmental issues that local governments are given. Some are actually are given very, very broad powers to carry out any general municipal purpose, whether it be tree protection, water quality protection, zoning, or dealing with a regulating police department or fire department through their state constitutional home rule powers. For example, Florida is a state that grants very broad state constitutional home rule powers to all of their local governments. Another type of power that is given to local governments comes through your home rule powers, through statutes instead of the state constitution. And some states have that. For example, in Colorado, some of the local governments are given the statutory, not a state constitutional home rule power to generally govern and carry out municipal purposes. But the large majority of the states, for example, the state that Chad and I live in, North Carolina, is a good example of this, actually enable local governments to regulate land or to regulate the cutting of trees through specific grants from the legislature, either through special legislation or general legislation. And that's generally where you're going to have to look. But it's important to know where it comes from and specifically to know what you can and cannot do. The second issue, legal issue, that I think is important to apprise everyone about deals with this question. It's an issue of vagueness, but the key to this this issue is when you draft your tree protection ordinance, you need to make very, very certain that the standards and the criteria that you use are clear and understandable. let me give everyone a couple of examples. And on this slide, we cite a couple of cases. The first is Watson versus the City of St. Petersburg. For any of you legal beagles out there, the citation on that case, if you want to look it up, is 489 Southern 2nd, 138. It was a case actually that I was counsel of record in. It's about 15 or 20 years ago. But the City of St. Petersburg had adopted some tree protection regulations in conjunction with some zoning designations where they identified preservation areas in the community. It was a very aggressive program for for 15 or 20 years ago. They had these preservation areas identified on a map, and before anyone could cut tree canopy in those areas as it was defined in those areas, they had to get a tree permit. And the regulation itself identified very limited exceptions as to when trees could, in fact, be cut. They had to have a permit for it. Well, Mr. Watson owned a piece of property that had about a 25 or 30 acre preservation area in it, and he decided he wanted to cut the trees. Didn't go out and get a permit, and not only did he basically clear cut about 2/3 of the site, he also excavated a large portion of it before the city learned about it. City learned about it. They then moved to enforce and require a restoration and reforestation plan. Mr. Watson turned around and he sued the city. And his attorneys, basically the claim they made was that the city's tree protection regulations were too vague, that the standards were not sufficiently clear. Basically, what the federal Constitution, the courts have interpreted the federal Constitution to require, and most states follow this principle of law, is that a regulation meets this vagueness claim or procedural due process if a couple things happen. Number one, the regulations are sufficiently clear and understandable that an average person is put on notice of what's required of them, doesn't have to guess. Second thing is that the regulations have to be sufficiently specific that they can be applied consistently to similarly situated property owners. The other case that I cite, and it's also one for anyone that is interested in looking it up. The citation on that is 594 Atlantic 2nd, 556. Is a case out of Maine, also very similar to Watson. It's interesting when communities do adopt tree protection regulations, someone violates them. Usually the first kind of claim they see is this vagueness claim. It dealt with a vagueness claim where a property owner had come in and intentionally, ultimately the Supreme Court of Maine recognized they had intentionally clear-cut a site and again claimed that the regulations were not sufficiently definite and violated vagueness. Fortunately, they were well written, clearly written, and withstood challenge. But that's the real important issue. Communities can have the best of intentions, but in terms of what they want to do with tree protection regulations. But just remember, it's very, very important that you draft that these regulations are well drafted. Clearly identify what you are going to regulate. The size of the trees, the type of the trees that are going to be protected in your regulation. Use measurable criteria. That's something that we like to do. And Chad will talk a little bit about that in our tree protection regulations. And make sure that the the standards are sufficiently measurable that they can be consistently applied to similar situations. If there's not a lot of latitude to treat different people differently. Third legal consideration that I want to touch on involves the takings issue. I'm sure that most everyone has heard claims made by property owners, either related to zoning regulations or tree protection regulations, canopy retention regulations, that this regulation is taking my property and it's a violation of the Constitution. Let me just say that generally speaking, while you need to be aware of this legal consideration, generally speaking, these types of claims usually don't result in serious, or don't create serious impediments for the design of a good tree protection regulation. Basically, there are two types of takings claims that might be relevant, not always, but might be relevant to a tree protection regulation. First is what the United States Supreme Court has characterized as a partial regulatory taking. That is basically the application of either a federal or state, in this instance a local regulation, that results in the denial of all economically beneficial use on a parcel. That's what the court in the late 70s, in a case out of New York, Penn Central versus City of New York case, held, and it's been the general rule since, that when a partial regulatory taking occurs. The other thing I will mention, though, is in addition to asking that question, and usually that requires the application of a tree regulation just limits the removal of trees from a site. It does not prevent development of occurring. Now, in the design of your regulations, I think it's important to provide safety valves so that if in fact trees would prevent a use from occurring on property, then that does need to be allowed. That would create a partial problem with respect to partial regulatory takings. The other type of claim that you might see is one that in fact I was involved in some litigation about 4 years ago out in Teton County, Wyoming, dealing with this issue, and that is, in many of our tree protection regulations, we ask property owners to identify a tree protection zone, an area of the property where the trees are going to be left in their natural state and protected. And there have been a number of claims that have been initiated by property owners claiming that those type of regulations result in a physical a violation of the takings clause, and they result in a physical occupation of the land, that the government is actually taking that part of a property owner's property. A couple things that I think that are important to keep in mind here. Number one is, back in this Penn Central case I mentioned earlier, the United States Supreme Court held that they in a footnote, they established the single part, what is called the single parcel rule. And it's important to remember in that what they said is, if we're going to look at the whole parcel. In other words, if a regulation maybe requires some set aside a tree protection area or an area to protect wildlife habitat, we're not just, you can't single that portion of the property out. We're going to look at the entire parcel. And the second thing that is, I think, important to remember is that to prove a physical occupation occurs, the property owner has got to be able to demonstrate that the government action compels a permanent, absolute physical occupation. situation where the property owner cannot exclude the public from the property. And with these tree preservation areas, they're usually private set-asides that that are for the benefit of the occupants of the site. I think that is a key component to keep in mind. Let me just mention one case for anyone that's interested in looking at this issue. I think that that discusses this in detail. It's a case that came out in New York about 2 or 3 years ago called the Town of Mendon versus Smith, 822 Northeast 2nd, 1214. It sort of talks about this taking issue in the context that I have raised it in. With that said, I'm going to conclude with making one other point relative to legal consideration, and that is with respect to the design of any either environmental or tree protection or zoning regulation. One of the other key points to remember is to ensure that it passes substantive due process or general process claims and is generally valid. The regulation has got to be reasonably related to a valid police power purpose. Now, the courts have been very, very lenient or broad in their thinking about what constitutes a valid governmental or police power purpose. I mean, environmental protection is certainly valid. Aesthetic controls are valid. Habitat protection is valid. Courts have recognized when this issue has been challenged that certainly tree protection is valid. But I think it's important. We believe that it's very important in drafting these regulations that you include in the very early parts of the regulation a set of purpose statements that clearly relate the reasons for tree protection and relate them to these general police power purposes. Very simple thing to do, but I think it's just important from a legal perspective. Things like, tree protection clearly furthers, environmental objectives, sustainability objectives. There are economic benefits. That's another well-recognized governmental purpose. I mentioned community aesthetics certainly is another, and any other reason that you might think is valid. So, with that said, Chad, I'm going to turn it over to you, and Chad is going to cover the elements of an effective tree ordinance.
Thanks, Craig. Hi, everyone. This is Chad Meadows. I also work at Clarion Associates with Craig, and I'm going to talk a little bit about tree ordinances and our practice experience with them, ways to generate effective ones. We're seeing more and more local governments across the country with ordinances that are protecting public trees. However, there's not quite as many that are focusing on protection of trees on private lands. And, we today would like to talk about ordinances that your local government would use to protect existing trees located on private lands during and after the development process. There's a lot of approaches that are used across the country. We're going to talk about the ones that we have found to be successful. So I'll just jump right in. Let me say in beginning that, there's sort of three hallmarks for an effective tree ordinance: predictability, consistency, and flexibility. Craig talked about, the need for clear standards, the legal mandate to have clear standards or to be predictable. Consistency is important, not just with community goals and the law, but also you need to make sure that your tree regulations are consistent with the political will and your enforcement capacity. Your ordinance is only as good as what can be enforced. So, your capacity to enforce it in the political will are important factors to keep in mind. And then finally, flexibility. Craig talked a little bit about the takings issue and the need for a safety valve. Building flexibility into an ordinance is a way to address things that you didn't anticipate in a fair, consistent, even-handed manner. So those are the three hallmarks to an effective ordinance. I'm not going to talk about all of these elements. Craig talked a little bit about the importance of purpose, but I have other issues. So let's jump in. Approaches, 4 basic approaches, or at least that's what we've seen in our practice. Retention of existing canopy, retention of specimen trees, or no requirements to retain existing trees, but rather reforest trees that were there. And then finally, blended approaches. Let's talk a little bit more about each one of these in a little bit more detail. Canopy retention standards. The idea here is that your tree ordinance would require sites that are going into the development process to retain a portion of the existing tree canopy during and after development. There are a lot of communities that have these kinds of provisions available on a voluntary basis, but we are seeing more and more local governments make these kinds of standards mandatory, where a portion of the tree canopy that exists should be retained in a tree protection zone after the development process. You see on the slide a table here from one of the communities where we've worked that basically establishes the range or the amount of tree cover canopy that would be kept in place after the development process based on zoning district. I think this particular, this table right here is from a community in South Carolina, and the 3 columns basically organize the different types of zoning districts and the amount of the amount of tree cover on the site that would need to be saved. The details of the mechanics aren't important. What is important is that this piece of the tree canopy protection puzzle deals with the protection of existing canopy after development. One of the most common forms of tree protection that we see in ordinances across the country are protections for specimen or heritage or champion or significant types of trees. These are the most special trees, the largest trees, the best examples in our communities. These kinds of provisions basically prohibit the removal of these things except when they're damaged, dying, or prevent development. There are usually fairly high bars in terms of threshold criteria that would allow somebody to take one of these things down. And as a disincentive, we often see what we call accelerated mitigation for removal, or in other words, if you cut a 32-inch tree down, that's okay, but you need to put back the same number of caliper inches in new trees, but these new trees might need to be, 6 inches in size when you plant them, so much larger, more robust, more expensive as a disincentive for cutting or removing a canopy tree. We see these things applied both to public and private lands, and even in some cases to existing residential lots, although that's fairly rare. I mentioned earlier when I started talking about the need for flexibility, reforestation is sort of a way to accommodate situations where tree protection is simply not possible given the context of the site, the type of use, the location, etc. Acts of God, other unintended consequences. So reforestation is a tool that you can use to allow an applicant or a proposed developer to come back and reestablish a canopy on the site, subject to some fairly stringent standards about establishing a tree protection zone, a place for the trees, and some fairly strict standards in terms of number, type, size. Those are very important elements if you want to establish a meaningful canopy. You need to make sure that the trees have proper spacing, etc. I'm sure you guys, most of the folks who are on the call, know more about tree biology than I do, but certainly reforestation and the need for strict standards about how that's accomplished is very important. I didn't talk about blended approaches. That's what we favor and what we're seeing most common in the codes that where we're working. We try to mix canopy retention requirements with specimen tree requirements, and allow people to reforest when necessary. Those are the three elements that we see. You don't necessarily need all of them, and we have certainly written ordinances that do not contain all three elements, but we believe the most effective ordinances are going to have those. But it doesn't stop there. It is possible, and we find it's a good idea to go ahead and offer some incentives in addition. Or if political will doesn't exist for mandatory tree canopy retention, perhaps an incentive-based approach might work. How does that work? Well, you can provide accelerated credit towards landscaping requirements for protection of trees, create some incentives, make it more profitable to keep the trees than to take them down, and to loosen up the regulatory framework so that it's possible to protect trees. Sometimes zoning ordinances in their zeal to protect health, safety, and welfare forget about site conditions on the ground. Sometimes you might want to give the ability to reduce setbacks or the amount of parking requirements or some other kind of development standard in the interest of protecting existing trees on the site. So, you see that sort of need for flexibility present itself again. The one thing to keep in mind when you're writing a tree ordinance is that you will need some mitigation standards. There are simply conditions or cases when trees need to be removed, regardless of how good your ordinance is. Unanticipated consequences can happen, and you need to have a procedure in place to deal with those. We are seeing replacement tree requirements, off-site planting requirements, communities requiring developers to post guarantees about making sure that the mitigated trees, the replacement trees that go in, are going to live. Let's say you post a bond to make sure that, the tree is going to stay alive for a 3-year period, or the money will be used to plant new trees. Some other innovative concepts that are going on out there are tree banks. This is a situation where a local government might either accept funds into a general account that it uses to purchase public trees, or the possibility of allowing, the idea of off-site planting, taking some of those required replacement trees and locating them elsewhere in the community in cases where, the site that they've been removed from simply can't accommodate the same number of trees that flow from the amount that was removed. One other thing I want to be sure to mention is that local governments are calibrating their requirements for replacement based upon whether the tree removal was accidental versus intentional. If a developer or the local jurisdiction can determine that the replacement or that the trees were removed intentionally, those kinds of replacement tree requirements for those situations are usually accelerated. Tree protection during construction is another element. So we've talked a little bit about the kinds of trees that you can protect with your regulations. We talked about incentives. It's important to make sure that your regulations include some componentry to protect the trees during the actual construction process. If you look at the picture, there's some existing trees located in the middle of what will become a parking island. No tree protection fencing, no limitation on grading, no nothing. Those trees are out there on their own and probably are not going to live. But had there been some tree protection fencing and some other mechanisms in place, like, say, a pre-site inspection of your fencing or establishment of limits of disturbance, those existing trees that you intended to stay on the site will actually make it through the development process. So I think the point to take away is it's not enough to have an ordinance that says you have to set trees aside. You also need to make sure that the safeguards are in place to keep them there during and after the development process. Finally, a word about enforcement. Earlier I mentioned, the 3 hallmarks: consistency, predictability, and flexibility. We've talked a little bit about flexibility. We've talked about predictability. But the need to be consistent with your political will and your jurisdiction's enforcement capacity is so. I really need to stress that because the public will get disillusioned if you prepare a fairly strong tree ordinance, but yet lack the enforcement capability or the knowledge in how to enforce the regulations. And so it's important that you gauge or calculate what you're going to protect based upon your capacity to protect it. How this is most often done is the inspection of the tree protection measures before the permit is issued. So, in other words, the city goes out on site and looks at the tree protection fencing before a grading permit is issued. Pretty simple way to make sure that trees get protected. Have some standards in your ordinance that help the city or your local jurisdiction determine, differences between when removal has happened accidentally versus intentionally. It can be argued that if a developer or an applicant had knowledge that there was a tree removal permit in place and they failed to obtain that, then obviously that was intentional removal, subject to some different standards and different responses from the jurisdiction. There unfortunately does need to be some punitive responses included in your arsenal, some disincentives for removing trees illegally. We're seeing things like delays in the permitting process for up to 5 years, or requirements to double landscaping during the development process. So there's a variety of tools out there. And then finally, making sure that you've incorporated inspection into your regulations, not just after it got planted, but after the trees have been in place for a while and had a chance to naturalize. So that's really, with that, I think it's time for questions. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jared, and we will try to answer any questions. Let me just leave you in saying that an effective tree ordinance is probably one of the strongest steps forward your community can make towards sustainability, given the situation with global climate change and people's changing tastes and sort of attitudes about the importance of ecological protection. So we find that these tree protection provisions, while they can be controversial, can give you a lot of mileage in areas that we all want to make progress in. So thank you, and I'll give it back to Jared now.
Great. Thanks, Chad. Thanks, Craig. Shay, can you open the lines for questions, please? Is the operator on the line?
As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone and record your name at the tone. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw your request, press *2. Again, that was *1, and it'll be just a moment for our first question.
Great. And participants can also ask questions online with the question and answer manager. Up at the top, one of the tabs says Q&A. Click on that and type your question in. I'll say for our friends who are listening on Skype, that will be the only way that you can ask a question. I want to say first, Chad and Craig, you guys do a Class A job. I had asked you to finish up by 20 so we could leave time for questions, and I forgot to mention that I was going to chew the first 10 minutes by introducing the call, so thanks for coming in right on time still. First thing I want to ask is, sometimes I hear from developers that business as usual is, clear the lot and then go about whatever the structure is, whether it's a parking lot or a building or something else. And they say that it isn't always necessarily more expensive to save the trees. It's just a matter of what was planned going into it. Is that your experience as well, or is it fairly certain that it will cost more if you do save the trees, regardless of whether it's planned in advance?
Craig, do you want to take that, or you want me to take a stab at it? I've got a thought with respect to, at first blush, Jared, we often encourage local governments to provide credit towards required landscaping for retention of existing trees. That's a way to save money. Limiting grading on a site, that's a way to save money. So, I think it's probably, in many ways, that cutting down existing trees could be more costly to an applicant, certainly more costly to the local environment. So, obviously it's going to be site-specific, but in general, I think that, tree protection is a very cost-effective way to maintain sustainable development concepts.
Even though I will say that in our work, we do hear from a lot of people that haven't been educated on this issue engineers and developer types that it is a lot less expensive for them to come in and clear cut a site. But interestingly enough, we've also, in a number of communities where we've worked, one of the events that trigger a strong political will to move forward with tree protection regulations are instances where that clear cutting or that clearing occurs like you're talking about, Jared. So,
can you expand on how ordinances calculate property, or can calculate into the equation for property value, and also within that, can ornamental trees count towards replacement requirements?
Well, on the property value, Chad, I'll answer the first part of that and let you answer the question about ornamental.
Okay.
On the calculating the property values, we do not, we don't have a formula to look at this question of increase. We have not looked at the increase in property values. We can only tell you that it's interesting in the higher value, communities where land values are at their highest are usually the communities that have very strong tree protection regulations. But we do not include a formula in the ordinance itself. And I don't think there's a need to.
As to the question about ornamentals being credited towards replacement trees, I think it really depends upon the situation. Certainly there are instances where it's more appropriate to use an ornamental tree, like in areas around utilities or sidewalks or streets. However, generally speaking, the ordinances that we've prepared, the way they've been crafted, at least the intent is that if existing canopy trees are cut down, then the expectation would be that canopy trees be returned, except in cases where there might be some utility conflicts or conflicts with public rights of way. In those situations, I think probably some kind of negotiated approach is probably the best solution.
Okay. Regarding canopy retention, can you talk about how to preserve this in the long term? Do we need a conservation easement, or can it be done without this? How have jurisdictions handled this?
That's an awesome question. Craig, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to?
Why don't you start, and then I'll add a few things about some legal considerations.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, you are absolutely right. And practice experience has shown us that it's not enough just to set the trees aside and let them remain on private lots. Folks, bless their hearts, they love trees. We understand that, but it might be time to put in the swing set, or we might decide that we want to clear out the back 40 for a volleyball court or something, and people can go in and cut those trees. So we talked a little bit about these tree protection zones as applied during the tree canopy retention stage. The tree protection zone needs to be demarcated on your site plan or your subdivision. We really encourage these kinds of things to be located on their own individual lots, so that they're not under private ownership, or they're under the ownership of the development owner or an owners association, and not individual lot owners within the development. So yeah, that's a really good question. And
usually too, a lot of the tree protection and canopy retention regulations that we've done have been done in the context of updating a development code. One of the other things we like to do is to sort of support tree protection is we also include in our development code zoning regulations what we call open space set-aside requirements. In other words, that a portion of a site, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial, whether it's industrial, is going to be set aside, to do a variety, could be done to do a variety of things, and like protect natural features on a site, but also any of these tree protection areas where canopy is being retained would be part of that open space. And as part of the open space, we include requirements for long-term management. The one point that I wanted to make on the legal side of things is I had talked a little bit about about setting aside communities that have set aside these tree protection zones or areas on the property, and they have you will occasionally see a legal challenge to that, claiming that that basically results in the taking. That they can't use that property. Now, the cases that have come out have generally said no, it isn't a taking. But I think a couple things are very important to do. One is make sure in your local regulation when you set up these tree protection areas that you set them up as private private set-aside areas. In other words, that the private property owner, the occupants and owners of that property, can exclude the public from the site. Because if you don't, that certainly will trigger some alarms, some bells, from a legal point of view. The other is, and I mentioned too, is that the need to just to have a safety valve to apply some flexible standards to ensure that there's just there's not going to be an outright denial of use on the site.
Okay. What problems or instances have you been involved with when a tree protection ordinance restricts a forest harvesting practice from taking place? What do you recommend an ordinance includes in order to limit this kind of conflict?
I mean, I don't think that we've done an ordinance which limits that.
Yeah, we try to exempt farmland and forest land. In ordinances that we've prepared, we find that most states have some statutes on the books that talk about what is a bona fide or an appropriate farming operation, what is or is not a bona fide or appropriate forestry operation. Generally speaking, we exempt those kinds of practices that are subject to some other kind of state requirement from needing to comply with the tree protection ordinance within the normal operation of their business. So as long as you're if you're a tree farm and you're operating as a tree farm, then you'd be exempt from tree removal requirements. Or if you were an acting farm, that was growing something and you needed to cut trees down to have access to fields, I don't think that the regulations would want to limit that. Now, when the development comes into the development process, that's a different matter, and that's probably the time when it's most appropriate to think about applying tree protection provisions.
Okay. Sometimes cities that have tree ordinances that place all maintenance and liability of street trees on the adjacent homeowners will legally justify not having an urban forestry department or any level of management for their street tree population. What can be done to convince these cities that street trees are their legal obligation to maintain?
Actually, Jared, could you read that question back again?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes cities who have tree ordinances that place all maintenance and liability of street trees on the adjacent homeowners will legally justify not having an urban forestry department or any level of management for their street tree population. What can be done to convince these cities that street trees are their legal obligation to maintain?
We have never, to my knowledge, have not really dealt with that issue. And my recollection is that in all the zoning ordinances that we have drafted, the maintenance of street trees has been a the street trees have been in, private land, so they've been the responsibility of the property owners to maintain. There certainly are a number of communities where, fairly large communities where street trees are put in place, and the association is obviously given the responsibility to management. But that's an issue, Chad. I don't know if you've had any experience with that, but that's been my experience.
Yeah, I think my experience is the same as yours, Craig.
Okay. Can you comment on a tree removal/mitigation formula that requires a post-construction minimum density requirement without regard for the density of trees prior to the development? This can help a reforestation effort in an area that doesn't have a lot of trees to begin with.
I think that's a really good question. You know, the reforestation formula needs to be clearly set out in your ordinance. Now, what that formula ends up being, I think it's desirable to establish that, you know, based on local conditions. I don't exactly know what those would be. It depends on, you know, where you are. But it is certainly conceivable that you have a formula for reforestation that establishes or reestablishes a canopy that's consistent with surroundings. I don't know that if you've got situations where there is no established canopy, say you've got an old farm that's being redeveloped as a residential subdivision, you decided that, you know, your community wants to have trees in that area or blocking that area, whatever the case may be. You know, I think you've just got to develop your reforestation standard based on local consensus, and I think that's going to vary based on, you know, where you are and what your objectives are with the reforestation program.
Okay. Are there any questions on the phone-in queue?
Yes, we do. Our one question comes from Mr. Baker. The line is now open.
Hi, Ken Baker, Southlake, Texas. Appreciate the presentation. I had one question. We require tree preservation on both residential, commercial type properties, but what we're finding is, particularly on the residential properties, the property owner is not aware that a conservation plan or a tree protection plan is in place, particularly when the property's been conveyed a couple of times. And we do include the tree protection areas on the development plan or on the site plan. And my question is, have you seen localities use any other types of techniques to convey the protection requirements to future property owners, talking 5-10 years down the road?
Well, usually what happens is generally what our provisions require is that there be some type of management entity like a property owners association established for the management of those tree protection or tree preservation areas, that they would then be included in the covenants for the subdivision. And obviously, if they are in the covenants of the subdivision, then the property owner is will know about them, will review them, you know, before the closing on the property. I mean, that's what we normally do.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Craig. I think from a pragmatic standpoint, from an operational standpoint, we've seen some communities who actually put a layer on their GIS. We're seeing more and more people have interactive maps where citizens can go and look at a base map and, you know, turn on or turn off different layers of, you know, various coverages from your GIS, whether it's zoning or tree cover or impervious surface, what have you. You know, I have seen some communities who include a tree cover layer. You know, if you have the staff or the resources to draw those lines on the map, I think certainly you could make that available via a GIS layer, so that people can, you know, as long as you've got a parcel-based system. So that's an operational solution that some communities have used.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Do you have any experience with tree protection ordinances in desert communities where terms like tree, forest, and canopy don't necessarily cover trees, but are plant related?
You know, we do have, well, is the question specifically desert communities, not mountain communities?
Las Vegas area, for example.
Well, we have, Chad, well, let me speak for myself. I do not in desert communities, but Clarion does a lot of work in Nevada, and in fact, we just finished updating the development code in Henderson, Nevada, and
yeah.
So other members of our firm do. Chad, I don't know if you worked on the tree protection issues out there or not.
Well, you know, we did a little bit of work out there, and basically I can tell you that at least in Henderson's case, you know, I mean, they do have some trees. There's some Joshua trees out there. There's some other kinds of acacias and other kinds of provisions. But, generally speaking, the tree protection ordinance that you see or that would come to mind in an eastern community simply doesn't work out there. I think there they focus more on washes and other kinds of areas, and they take them. You may have remembered Craig talked earlier about open space set-aside and requirements that a portion of a site be set aside and left undisturbed. Henderson, uses that approach, and by default, areas that have existing vegetation are included in those kinds of set-aside areas. But it's a good point. What do you do about vegetation protection in desert communities? It's a tough issue. In Henderson, they just set aside land, and that's how it's done.
In your presentation, you mentioned bars for heritage tree removal. What are those?
Let's say, for example, most of the specimen tree standards that we have prepared apply to public and private sites, and they say that specimen trees need to remain unless they are damaged, dying, dangerous, or inhibit access to the site. If there's no way to basically configure the site to take advantage of the development potential that's on the site, then the tree can be removed. But generally speaking, trees need to be retained wherever possible, and that's usually the approach that's taken. That's coupled with some strong disincentives in terms of replacement cost, and that's the approach that we've used. It's been fairly successful. I think the approach is you try to make what you want easy and what you want difficult, and that seems to have the best approach. There are going to be situations where a specimen tree needs to be removed, and there's not much you can do about that except have a set of mitigation requirements that will at least give the tree a fighting chance when it comes down to balance sheets and pro formas.
Okay. In forming a tree ordinance, what type of community input is helpful in that process? Do you have suggestions for educating local officials, citizens, developers, and others?
I'll tell you, I can certainly tell you how we typically, or relay how we typically go about drafting these kinds of regulations. First of all, we will go into a community. In some instances, we will do a sort of a kickoff meeting, a public presentation, identifying, what the general goals are, and sort of spelling out a work program. At the same time, we also think it's very, very helpful, and this involves community input, is sitting down one-on-one with a representative group of stakeholders, nonprofits, environmental organizations, neighborhood organizations, and members of the development community, to get everyone's input. We then generally prepare an outline of what the ordinance will look like. We then will take those out to meetings with the public generally, or with elected officials, and then do the same after the ordinance is adopted. The other thing is, in recent times, we are using the web a lot more frequently to provide opportunities for public inputs. In a lot of our development code work now, we've been designing websites that the public can access that both educate them about regulatory issues, tree protection, other zoning issues, as well as provide them an opportunity to comment on anything. So that's sort of our typical modus operandi.
Great. Well, I would like to let you guys conclude by telling everyone about, a little bit more about the work you do consulting on tree ordinances and design standards, and tell the listeners, who include organizations, municipalities, and such, what services you can offer them.
Well, Clarion is, we are a land use growth management zoning consulting firm. We have offices here on the East Coast in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, office in Denver, Colorado, and Chicago, Illinois. We have affiliate office in Cincinnati and in Florida. And we offer a broad range of services. We draft a lot of development and zoning codes, and a lot of that work is where we have been drafting either canopy retention or tree protection regulations. We also offer our services, though, to local governments just to draft tree protection ordinances and regulations. In addition to that, we work with local governments on growth strategies and comprehensive planning. Right now we are working from Bainbridge Island in Washington State to Pompano Beach in southeast Florida. We work throughout the southeast, throughout the Midwest, and throughout the Rocky Mountain West and West Coast. Chad, I don't know if you want to add anything else or not, but
yeah, well, two things. One is you can reach us online at www.clarionassociates.com, and our phone number was listed at the front of the presentation. Jared, I don't know if people have access to that or not, but there it is, 919-967-9188.
And I'll post the phone number and your contact information in the resource list we make available to people afterwards.
Great.
Great. Well, thank you, guys.
thank you.
That's going to end the recorded session of the presentation. The recording will be available along with the PowerPoints and resource list in about a week, and I'll send the link to everyone who completes the survey that is up on the screen. This helps us to improve our programs and just takes a couple minutes, so we'd really appreciate it. The next session of the Thursday webcast series is on February 19th. It is State Advocacy for Trees. With that, I want to thank Chad and Craig for presenting today, all the participants who listened in, and our sponsors, the Home Depot Foundation and the USDA Forest Service. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for participating in today's conference call. At this time, you may disconnect.